Good morning. Well, we're going to be moving into a new session. Before I go into that, though, I wanted to mention some, because we mentioned the Reflections teaching letter, and it happens that one of the that the prayer on the front. Oh, this one's all torn up. I can't read it from here anyway. The prayer on the front is particularly meaningful. My wife Karen found it to be extremely meaningful, and I've had her do that. If you just to find it for you here, if I go to the Reflections teaching letter, but I do encourage you to get it, and you can even download a PDF of the thing, as you can see here. But here is the prayer: Father, I'm so often tempted to put my hope in all the wrong things. I'm tempted to hope in people to gain security, to hope in possessions to gain significance, and to hope in position and performance to gain satisfaction. Isn't that true, by the way? So many people do look for those things in those places. But all of these will let me down because I can only discover these things in you, not in the world. And now, Lord, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. When I am distressed and disappointed, may I hope in you. When I am betrayed and misunderstood, may I hope in you. When I lose my possessions, may I hope in you. I will exult in hope, knowing that your promises can never be thwarted by circumstances and setbacks. You will never desert me, nor will you ever forsake me. I will hope only in your perfect and unchanging character, knowing that you will carry me safely to your eternal kingdom. That's not a bad thing for you to review from time to time, isn't it? Because it's kind of the whole range of joy and despair in that. So I just felt prompted to share that with you because it meant a good deal to my bride, and I thought it would be good for you to have as well. We are now going to go, whenever I show you this slide, it's because we're going to be transitioning into a new topic. This is the slide I've been using, Dennis, almost since our inception. We began with 8 spiritual essentials, and then we went into the series. That's how it was, and you can still find them all on the website. But we were looking at these areas here. Let me find it for you here. And these were the areas we looked at. Again, relationships, work, stewardship, spiritual life, a lot of time on that. Then we looked at purpose and passion, did a little series on that, and discerning God's will, dealing with temptation. Now we are up to margin in life. And that's contextualizes it. Margin in life, a rather relevant thing, and a thing that many people do not enjoy. So it's a whole perspective of how do we gain margin. Richard Swenson wrote a book called Margin, Restoring Emotional, Physical, Financial, and Time Reserves to Overloaded Lives. Now, this came out a long time ago, but it's really, in my mind, as relevant today as it was when it was written. And he's written some other things as well, a book that I'm going to be using in addition to this one called A Minute of Margin. It's sort of a devotional, and it has a number of sessions on that. And I wanted to use him because I think he's the master of conveying and communicating what margin is about. So he has some other books as well, but these are 2 that I'm going to be using. And so I've selected certain pages for you, and this is not one of them, but 36 is. So what I've done now is, because the only way I know to do this is to actually give you this PDF, and this way you can see it. For those of you who are visual learners, it's helpful to see. And I don't know how many of you find the visuals to be of help. Perhaps some people, I hope they're not distracting, but I try to make it where at least you can kind of connect another sense with it. That's my thinking here. But this 5 environments struck me in this book as being very important. Most of our progress, he says, as he describes it then in this process here, most of our progress, physical environment, we've made great progress in many, many ways in terms of the achievements of wealth and technology, health in the material world. Lots of challenges since he wrote this book, though, as you well imagine, things that he wouldn't have imagined that have been occurring. But still, remarkable technological progress in many respects. Our physical environment, but also our cognitive environment. knowledge, information, education, the intellectual world. Once again, however, that, as you well know, has its downside. And never has such absurdity been pervaded and propagated as now occurs, and people becoming less and less capable of reasoning and so forth, being dumbed down. But still, lots of progress in those two realms, as we can imagine. But most of our pain, as he describes, comes from the social environment, speaking about family, friends, neighbors, church, the societal world, the emotional environment. So especially pain with regard to your feelings or your attitudes, the psychological world, and of course there's always the spiritual environment, the eternal and transcendent. And so you look at these 5 environments, then you realize that, especially since he wrote this book some decades ago, you just think about what the world is like, and if one were a Rip Van Winkle and went and woke up and was born, let's say, 20 years ago. And so just do a thought experiment. If it was, let's say it's the year 2000, okay, and then you wake up and it's 2022. What do you think? Would you be able to manage? There would be so much cognitive dissonance. We ease into it like we go through life. We accept our aging because it's so slow. You see, so we put up with it. We put up with a lot of absurdities and nonsense on a gradual, iterative basis. But if it hit you all at once, you'd be overwhelmed. Karen and I were just looking at a thing that was advertising an Ozzie and Harriet episode. It was so strange to see just what that was like. And and it immediately brought me back, and you've heard me say this before, I regard myself as being pretty fortunate insofar as I was born at a time and at a place in this country when I was born, best time ever in the human history to have been born, as I see it. And I'm not talking about nostalgia here. There's lots of reasons for it. And so I am very grateful. And I do not wring my hands at the absurdities of this world, but actually, as you've heard me say before, isn't this what the Lord himself told us was going to be happening when in the last days you'd be preparing the stage for the next act? He made this clear. And I've been teaching this all along. Ever since the 70s, I've said there will even be overt persecution of Christianity in this country. It seemed remote at that time, but I knew it was so. And I remember actually saying that very thing. I didn't know how, but I knew it was going to occur. And now it's becoming more obvious, and it'll continue to get more. But instead of wringing my hands in despair, instead I see this is an opportunity for me to zoom in and focus on the things that are going to endure. Rather than being defined by the things that are passing, I'm more defined by the things that will endure. And that is why, by the way, this world-to-word ratio is so interesting to me, that I've talked to you about before. Because if you look at most believers, I'm being generous if I say it's a 10-to-1 world versus word ratio. That is to say, for every 10 hours that they're exposed to the world and its messages, they're exposed to the Word and its messages. And by the world, I mean multiple sources, and by the Word, I mean multiple sources. Not just reading your Bible, but even noticing God in beauty in nature, you see, or many other resources that you can have, and chewing on Him and practicing His presence. I think it's not a good ratio. And if I could find ways in which people could go down even just to 5-to-1, but you'll never do that on your own probably. It probably requires some kind of collective discipline where you have an accountability and you say, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to make this happen. You're probably not going to do it because you see we're more concerned about the opinions of people than we are of God. Why? Because you see people. So you're more concerned about whether if someone personally, physically catches you than if God catches you. And then it's intriguing. Of course, God will always catch you. He's always there. And it's the strangest thing. So we do things by ourselves that we would never do if we were with someone. It's an astonishing thought. But you see, part of that's related to this world-to-word ratio. And so the more time, because you are defined by the people you meet, the books you read, the things you expose yourself to. And so if we are exposing ourselves to those things which are not true and right and lovely and pure and of good repute, then there is something fundamentally wrong. And so when I think about Philippians here, and this well-known text that we have used more than once, whatever is true, honorable, right, pure, lovely, good repute. If there's any excellence, anything worthy of praise, what does he command us to do? Dwell on those things. It's a command. Chew on those things. And what we have got there is the perfect opposite of the news. You see, I can define the news by the opposites of these words. The news will not focus on what's true, but on what's false. Not what's honorable, but what's dishonorable. Not what's right, but what's wrong. And so it goes. You can see that. So how then do you expect, if you're not dwelling on these things, if you're not renewing your mind with the truth of the Word, that you're going to actually then be able to grow spiritually if you are allowing the world to have so much impact that you become so conformed to the world? And so we're called to renew our minds and therefore not be transformed by the world, but by the Word, you see. So instead of being conformed to the world, you're being now transformed by the new renewing of your mind, so you're conformed to the Word, and the living Word, Jesus. So it requires that. We'll talk about this sometime. I'm almost thinking of making an app out of this, where you would actually monitor your time. You could actually set the parameters. It'd be very easy to do, where you could then put that in there. And it could be a reminder for you to bump up the time on a very gradual basis. As with anything in training, you don't do it all at once. It has to be it's a long obedience in the same direction, very slow, iterative, but you can slowly build up like in training. And I think it'd be a very important thing. I say all of this because we're talking about an environment then that is defined by what the Scriptures tell us rather than by what we think it's to be. And so in that respect then, let's see if I can find I'm obviously not going to teach the whole book, but right here. Here are suggestions for decompressing stress-filled lives. These are wonderful summaries, and I'm going to be going into more detail with these kinds of things. But if you just considered the idea of these specific suggestions, they are themselves, because we have this problem that we're running and gunning and blowing and going and plotting and planning and ducking and diving. You see, a lot of people are just they're on this fast track but where are they going? I don't know, but we're making great time. It's not a good thing. You see people in haste, they're on the freeway and you're heading down to Florida and they're in such a hurry to get there, and then they're bored when they get there. It's amazing it's astonishing, but they're so important for them to go so fast. And nobody enjoys the journey. They only think of the destination, but the problem then is you're not living, because the destination's always future, you see. And so most people are not alive to the grace of the precious present. And that's really a critical thing. It is a precious present, and it's all you've got. You know this. You don't have yesterday. You don't have the past. You don't have this morning even, this earlier part. You don't have the future. All you have is what? This now, this moment, so that if you then welcome Jesus into that precious present and become a person who's aware of his presence and treasuring this as all you've got. You see, this is right now in our time together. This is all we have. You see? And if you begin to look at that, wherever you are, Jim Elliot put it beautifully, wherever you are, be all there. Isn't that a great way to put it? Wherever you are, be all there. So many people are not all there. What are they doing? They're thinking about what they're going to do. And later in the day, they're thinking about the news. They're having a lunch and they're thinking about something else. And they're not alive to that grace of the present moment. And therefore it's lost. And therefore there are people who are more and more stressed because they cannot stop and be still and wait and be with the Lord and invite him into that experience in that moment. So if you treasured this precious present as all you've got, which it really is right now, although it zooms by, still it's there, isn't it? And to live to the hilt any situation you believe to be the will of God, you see, be all there. And if it's the will of God, live it to the hilt. So be alive. And most people are almost zombie-like in their ways of living and thinking. They react, they're just shuddering around and moving around, but they're not energized by the power of the Spirit of God and by a bigger and greater vision of what life's meant to be about. Because you see, you are in fact heading home, and you're not home yet. So to be aware of God's grace in this now, because what he's doing this day is preparing you for that day, if you'll receive it as such. So you receive what he's given you this day as preparation for that day, the day when you stand before him and give an account, as we must do. And it's required of a steward that he is what? You're a steward, as you know, which means you manage the possessions of another. You don't own anything at all. You think you do, you don't. All right? What's it required of a steward then? What's the deal? That he be faithful, you see, because we will give an account. How did you use the time that I gave you? How did you use the abilities that I gave you? The resources or earthbound resources that I gave you? The relationships, you see. How did you invest those things? And I can confidently tell you that the questions he's going to ask us at the judgment seat will be along the lines of stewardship and your fidelity and your faithfulness to it. And the reality then is to live in such a way that you have a holy anticipation of home and a holy fear of God's displeasure. There's no condemnation in Christ. You will not be condemned, but you can suffer loss. Salvation is by grace through faith, but rewards are based on works, you see, rewards in the kingdom of heaven. So it is required that if it's a faith that's alive, it's a faith that will bear fruit and it'll produce something. And so we are called to be accountable to that. And so when I think about these ideas then, I want people to live in such a way that they're more and more amazed by and intrigued by and anticipatory of their home, you see. How many people long for home? How many people do you know who are so eager to be with the Father, to be in his home, in the Father's house, and to be in that new creation, that they are becoming homesick and world weary? And that's what you need to be doing to do. Most people, even churchgoers, want to live longer in this vale of tears. They want to live longer. And they think it's a loss for them to leave this because they suppose they're in the land of the living. We are not. We're in the land of the dying, heading to the land of the living. And so why is it that people want to imagine retirement and it's going on forever on this earth? It becomes grotesque. No, the more you are walking with Jesus, the more you must transfer your affections from the physical, the material, the visible, to those things that will last forever. Because faith is the substance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So therefore, it's not yet, and you don't have it. You see, it's not yet, and it's not visible. So how do I transfer my hope and aspiration from this material, visible world to that which is I can't see and it's not yet? How do we do that? And in coming to love him more and more, we begin to have a heart transformation here whereby we can come to know him because we love him. And if you love him, you want to be like him. And so you begin to actually cultivate an appetite for home. And I think I told you this even last week that I'm doing that with Karen now. We're doing thought experiments about what home will be like, and it's going to be an amazing thing. And I've given you this before, but it's well worth your reflecting on this. When you realize there's not going to be any pain, sorrow, suffering, disease, death. That's not bad. But more than that, you're going to be in a resurrected body that will be glorified like Christ's resurrected body. And this body is beyond our comprehension when we begin to study what we know, because we know it to be like his body. And moreover, you will never get tired or all these things, but in fact, your capacity, your cognitive capacity will be vastly greater. And your capacities for pleasure, because God's diminished our capacity for pleasure. We can't even manage the pleasures that we're getting 1,000 removes from the wellspring of God's right hand. We can't manage them. But when that sin has been dealt with, you see, and when it's all been dealt with at the judgment seat of Christ, and then we are not only fully conformed to Christ, not only in our spirit, as we currently are, in your deepest self, that's where you are, seated within the right hand of the Father, but you're going to be conformed to him in your soul, the way you think, what you love, you see, your mind. That right now is in a process of transformation. It's not complete, but your soul will be purged and purified, and your imaginations, your aspirations will be perfectly conformed to the love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control that is the life of Christ, you see, but through the prism of your personality. And moreover, then your capacities, your powers, and so forth, your creativity, your longevity, it's going to be beyond imagination. And then you add to that, oh, did I forget to tell you that the world system will be now dealt with and judged? And that the devil and his angels will be now confined? And that this flesh now having been done away with, so you won't even be able to think sin? That's not bad. And then you add to that a new order of physics, a new heavens and a new earth. And though this wonderful world, in spite of its fallenness, is astonishing and filled with glory and beauty, may I tell you, eye hasn't seen or ear heard what he's planning, but I'm going to tell you, the order of the new creation, it'll be a doxological physics. Now, no one's ever said that before. I just made it up. And what I mean by doxological physics is that your experience of space and time in that new order of creation, where there is no need for the sun or the moon. It's a different world. But it says very little about the world, new heavens and a new earth. And then he mentions the earth had no sea, but then he goes on, the rest of it's about the bride, the body of Christ, the New Jerusalem. So it's beyond our imagination. But let me tell you, though, that your experience of space and time will be that which glorifies God. Right now, time, what is it? It's an enemy that takes your life away. As time goes by, you lose vitality. Isn't it so? Birth, growth, decay, and death, in that inevitable decline. But then time will be your agent, your medium, your friend. So you'll swim in it rather than luxuriate in it, which means you'll have all the time. You won't be rushed. You'll have more infinite, boundless margin. And then when I consider the idea of space as well, I have a rather strong suspicion that we can think of a place and be there. I also rather hope that somehow we'll be able to actually even change our dimension so that we can zoom down into the smallest realms and zoom back out. I would love to do that right now with any flower I look at, because if you could slowly zoom down, you'd be in a world of awesome wonder. Puff the Coral Seas, if you haven't seen that on Netflix, I told you about that last week, do see it. It shows close-ups of corals, and you begin to see, oh my word, it's so rich and wonderful that you begin to realize you're being ravished by that beauty and complexity that transcends your imagination. What do you suppose, if that's a hint of home, the reality will be like? So I'm trying to paint a picture. And what will you be doing? Endless creative activity without frustration to the glory of God, as I like to describe heaven, which means you will be a gardener. And in the materials of the new creation, unlike an old creation that's recalcitrant and resists our intentions, in this world, it'll be compatible with, and you'll be able to shape and do things. Think of what you'll be able to do. Think of all the things you now have to admit you cannot now do. Think of the number of things. When you reach a certain point, you realize, there's some things I'll never be able to do that I hoped I would have time. You reach a certain point where you reach the midlife crisis, usually around age 38 to about 45, and then you become aware of your mortality. You always knew theoretically you were, but now you've experienced it and you realize through your admission, I'm not going to be able to do this as much as I'd like to. I won't have time. And everything I take on is another thing I can't do. And then you realize life itself is like a game of musical chairs. Remember in musical chairs when you were in school? What was the idea? The music is going on, and there's a number of chairs. What happens? When the music stops, somebody's got to grab a chair, but there's always one less. You see? And that's your life. God is taking away significant chairs in your life as the music continues and stops, you see. He'll take away this chair, and then you have to decide, what are the chairs that matter most? And it better well be those things that will matter most, not possessions, not position, not power, not performance, not popularity, prestige. It's going to be relationships, isn't it, at the end? So when you get down to that, he reduces our appetite, or should, and actually expands our appetite, focuses it, and reduces it for the things that won't matter until you begin to cultivate an aspiration, a heart for home. And that's what I'd like you to find and figure out ways of doing that, if you can. Now, that's a little sermonette that I didn't plan to give, but I just did that. So we have a couple more minutes. So to summarize, practice gratitude, and we're going to be talking about that, what the power of gratitude, of goodwill. Really, volunteer work, an interesting thing. When people are depressed, when they're down, when they're despondent, the best thing you can do is to stop throwing a pity party and help someone else out. You see, when they do that, it helps a lot. Even that are realistic expectations, because I catch myself constantly supposing I can do this, that, and the other, and I have to be realistic. In fact, I have to be patient, because I always am ahead of what God has in mind. And I know that's my tendency. So therefore, I have to wait on the Lord and be patient, because in repentance and rest is your salvation. In quietness and trust is your strength. So that's for me. Laugh, inner jogging, interesting idea. There's something powerful about laughter with friends, isn't there? There's just something that's healing and wholesome. And there's a physiological basis that it produces as well. Very few people, most adults stop playing in the best sense of that word. They stop creating and so forth. I don't want you to be one of those. But instead, there's a second naivete. The first is when you're a child, but now the second naivete is that you have a childlike wonder and that you can play. My writing and creating and ideas and putting, that's my sandbox. You see, I like to create things and so forth. What is it that you love to do, you see? In fact, what is it that when you do it, you feel God's pleasure? To use that line from Chariots of Fire, when I run, I feel his pleasure. What is it that when you're doing it, you can feel the pleasure of God? And then meditation. And frankly, we can do that a lot more than we suppose, because remember, God created us in such a way that we can be conscious of two levels at the same time, heaven and earth, the spiritual and the material. And you as an amphibious being then have one foot in both worlds. And so meditation is always available to you if you choose to practice His presence in the routine of things. And of course, prayer goes along with that, except what cannot be changed. And that's a hard thing for us to do, to realize there are limits, and things will begin to become more stenotic. Stenosis sets in, not just physical, but other things get tightened and lose their volume. Avoid frustration, that's a very good one. Never must I work on something. If something goes wrong, haywire in my house, if it's after about 11 o'clock, I better not even touch it, because when I have physical diminishment, When I'm tired, I don't have the margin I need psychically to manage these things. And if I try to do that, I'll only get bummed out. I've seen that. Exercise, I hate to exercise, but I know that it is in fact beneficial. And so it's disproportionate. So I'm always working on that. And then the next page is learn to relax, calls it behavioral aspirin. And there is that time when you have stillness, quietness, and we need a time when you literally don't do anything. Pascal said that man's basic problem is that he cannot sit quietly in his room because it's hellacious for people to sit quietly. That's why they call it solitary. Frankly, I wouldn't mind solitary. It's the other prisoners I'd be worried about. You see, I'd rather be in solitary than with in the yard. But that's just another matter. Because at least I could be aware of him and meditate on that. More control in your life, conflict. Obviously, control can be an illusion, but with the things that you can reconcile conflict and personal life. So be a peacemaker. And avoid anger and the desire for revenge. Those are two of my fundamental flaws, as you saw in our discussion of the temptations that we have in our lives. So what I'm going to leave you with is just this little list here, because I neglected to write out 3 questions. I wasn't sure where I was going to go. I couldn't figure out how am I going to, because it's not as clear as linear. But I think this wouldn't be a bad little list to chew on and to assess for the next 15 minutes. So chew on this. How are we doing in those ones right there, you see? Wouldn't be a bad thing to zoom in on. When we were starting, I don't think I gave you enough on what I mean by margin. So let me make clear what I mean by margin, because I wasn't as obvious as I should have been. And I'm going to be using a different book by Swenson, a book that I'm going to be zooming in on in more detail in a little bit later on. So I'm going to start with his book, Margin, but then I'm going to be using A Minute of Margin. That's the book I'd recommend you all consider getting, because it's excellent. Because it consists of a lot of these 2-page deals here, margin and finances, a 2-page overload in the family, breaking the speed limit of life, curbing the cluttering, economics of the relational life, gratitude, work accessibility, and ruthless expectations. So it's a very helpful book, in my opinion, for you to consider, very practical as well. But here at the beginning, he describes and defines what he means by margin, and this is what I want you to see. Margin is a space, specifically the space between our load and our limits. I was using the metaphor of bandwidth, another way of knowing your limits, and not always stretching them and pressing them until you don't have any more room to go, if you're always at maxed out. So he says it's a space that enhances vitality and resilience. In this space, that guarantees sustainability. It's in the space where healing occurs, where our batteries are recharged, where our relationships are nourished, and where wisdom is found. And so without margin, then both rest and contemplation are but theoretical constructs or concepts. What he means by this is another way of looking at it is this. Why then do we insist on leaving no buffer, no space, no reserves in our day-to-day, you see? So he uses this metaphor of falling 2 inches behind a car. Imagine somebody is falling on 400 and they're 2 inches away from the car in front of them. It's exceedingly terrifying, so one thing, but also there's no margin for error, the slightest thing. And you've ever been able to see sometimes way ahead of you that something, they're stopping so fast, there's going to be an accident up ahead? And I've had that experience. I think I told you, didn't I, about when I was in the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel? It's a good example of that. My father was a bus driver for 45 years, I think, and never had an accident. I don't know how he did this, going from New Jersey to New York and all that. Don't know how. But he taught me, one of the things he taught me well was always drive, not in front in terms of the car in front of you, but look ahead of him. and plan. You can actually plan and avoid things. You can painfully obvious. There's a bus over there, and you can see it way ahead of you. So work your way over here, so you don't have to be caught. Or if you begin to see things stopping way ahead of you, you start stopping soon. Boy, did that pay off one time, because I was taking the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel from Manhattan to Brooklyn, and it was this portion of it was two ways, just a two-way. So what happened, and visibly remember, way ahead of me, I saw red lights. A quarter of a mile in front of me, I saw red lights, and they were starting to come my way. Immediately, I start hitting my brakes in such a way that I don't want the guy behind me to hit me, so I'd back off, and he thought I'm a nutcase and probably loathed me because of what I was doing. But as I saw it approaching us, I slowed that car as quickly as I possibly could without making the guy behind me hit me. And I stopped, and two cars in front of me, in fact, actually it was the car just in front of me, was the last to be in a series of collisions. You see, there was a series of collisions because somebody didn't have enough margin, they braked too quickly, which means somebody else didn't have enough, and so it moves, and it goes backwards. So by choosing to play in that direction, so you know what I did then? When I saw this is not going to go good, I just made a U-turn and went out of the tunnel. Now that advice saved me a lot, because I wouldn't have been perhaps have that acuity to see that. And I'm saying that in part, living with margin is not biting off more than you can chew. We have phrases for it, don't we? Biting off more than you can chew. Taking on more than you really could really reasonably take. That means I have to say no to a lot of things that I'd like to do. Speaking engagements or something of that nature. And so that you have to have then enough sensitivity to the promptings of the Spirit that you have to have quietness and rest. And you can't do that if you're never stopping. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Buffer, space, reserves in your day-to-day.